excited to have Natalie Wexler here to talk with us about learning loss and reading in the time of the COVID virus. And Natalie, I will do a brief recitation of her biography. I'll have shortened it, but before we start, I want to mention that just this week, Natalie has another article in the Atlantic Monthly that I'll link to in my follow-up email to you. And hopefully I'll have Natalie's slides that I can send you also, and the slides will obviously be on the video too. But I just read that article this afternoon as I was getting ready for this meeting, and it's a great article. I think you'll all like it. It focuses sort of a profile on a teacher in Eastern Tennessee, so I think you'll enjoy it. So, well, here I go. So Natalie Wexler is an education writer and the author of The Knowledge Gap: The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. She is also the co-author with Judith Hochman of The Writing Revolution, a guide to advancing thinking through writing in all subjects and grades. She is a senior contributor to the Education Channel on Forbes.com. Her articles and essays on education and other topics have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and other publications. She has spoken on education before a wide variety of groups and appeared on a number of TV and radio shows, including Morning Joe and NPR's On Point and 1A. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and has 2 children. So if you take a moment to welcome Natalie with me, either by clapping or you can use your thumbs up or your hand signs there. And Natalie may be asking you guys some questions during this, so please feel free to use the thumbs up or the hand clap or just wave on the screen to help Natalie out as she moves through her presentation. So thank you, Natalie, for being with us.
Well, thank you, Barbara, for inviting me, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to reach teachers who are the most important audience for this message. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. About 10, 11 years ago now, I started getting very interested in education, and especially in this gap, what's called often the achievement gap, in test scores mostly, between kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. And when I started looking into this and writing about it, what seemed to me to be the case, and what I was certainly told was the problem, the real problem, was high school. That's where the test scores were lowest, the gap was the widest, the kids were the most disengaged. And this has been the question for a long time and continues to be in a lot of sort of education reform quarters. What's the matter with high school? And what I stumbled across, I really did not figure this out for myself, somebody eventually explained it to me, was that the problems that become so apparent in high school do not begin in high school. They really have their roots in what I was told was the bright spot in education reform, elementary school. And what I'm really talking about here is the way we teach reading in elementary grades and sometimes beyond. Now, there are 2 basic aspects to reading. There's decoding or sounding out, or sometimes it's called word recognition, but basically reading words. So the decoding side aspect of reading is basically a set of foundational skills and should be taught that way. Phonemic awareness, hearing the sounds in words and then connecting them to letters, that's phonics. And fluency, being able to read at an appropriate pace with appropriate expression. But we do have major problems in many places in this country with the way decoding is taught. But I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about the other aspect, basic aspect of reading, which is comprehension. Obviously, if you're going to be a good reader, you need both. And I would argue that even though the problems with decoding have been getting more attention lately, I would argue that the problems with the way we teach comprehension are actually more widespread and better hidden. So let's take a quick look at how we teach comprehension, the standard approach. One part of the approach is that there are a set of comprehension skills and strategies. I won't go into the distinction because those 2 terms are usually used interchangeably, but there are a whole bunch of them. Identify main idea and details, determine author's purpose, or make inferences. And often there will be a skill of the week, and the teacher will model that skill using a book chosen not for its content, but really for how well it might lend itself to demonstrating something like comparing and contrasting. And then the other part of this approach is that kids will go and practice those skills on books that have been determined to be at their individual reading levels. And that could be, and these are assessed periodically, their individual reading level could be years below their grade level or theoretically above. But in many classrooms, a lot of kids are reading books that are, maybe a second grade level, like a level L. That's the level they've been determined to be at, but maybe they're in fourth or fifth grade. And the theory is that if kids just practice these skills, if they get really good at finding the main idea or making inferences or whatever, that they will be able to advance up this ladder of text complexity. And also they'll be able to apply those skills to understand anything that's put in front of them, whether it's a passage on an end of the year reading test or a textbook down the road in high school or beyond. So let's test out that theory briefly. I'm just going to show you a paragraph from a newspaper and ask you to find the main idea, and I'm sure you're all expert readers, so this shouldn't be a challenge. Much depended on the two overnight batsmen, but this duo perished either side of lunch, the latter a little unfortunate to be adjudged leg before, and with Andrew Simons too being shown the dreaded finger off an inside edge, the inevitable beckoned, bar the pyrotechnics of Michael Clarke in the ninth wicket. Now, I'm imagining that some of you, or maybe all of you, are thinking, what's this about? Forget the main idea. I don't even know what this is about. And what I didn't tell you is that this paragraph was taken from a British newspaper. And if you were a cricket fan, you would have no trouble making sense of this paragraph, finding the main idea or whatever. But if you don't know anything about cricket, this paragraph is really pretty impenetrable. I mean, you may know the individual words like leg and before and adjudged, but what does it mean to be adjudged leg before? Well, this is something that cognitive psychologists who study the process of learning, something they've known about for a long time. Back in the 1980s, late 1980s, there was a study that has come to be known as the baseball study. And the point of this study was to determine what is more important to reading comprehension. Is it general reading ability or skill, or is it knowledge of the topic you're reading about? And the researchers chose the topic of baseball because they figured there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they took a bunch of 7th and 8th graders, divided them up into 4 groups, depending on how well they had done on the standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them all a passage describing a baseball game and tested their comprehension. And what they found was that the kids who knew a lot about baseball all did quite well when the topic was baseball. And the kids who didn't know much about baseball all did pretty poorly. And in fact, if you look at those 2 middle lines, the dark green one on the left, those are the supposedly poor readers who knew a lot about baseball, and to their right are the supposedly good readers, that blue bar, who didn't know much about baseball. The poor readers who knew about baseball did a lot better than the good readers who didn't. So this is pretty convincing evidence that what's really important is not general reading skill, but knowledge of the topic. The more you know about a topic, the better your reading comprehension is going to be. And this study, these results have been found in numerous other contexts. This is a very well-established finding. And what it tells us really 2 things. One is that reading skill is not a skill like riding a bicycle. The more you practice it, the better you get. It's going to, how good you are as a reader is going to depend a lot on the topic and how much you know about it. And secondly, it tells us there really is no such thing as a fixed individual reading level or fixed reading level in general. Again, it's going to depend on the topic and how much the reader knows about it. So this may be kind of obvious in a situation involving cricket or baseball, sort of a body of specialized knowledge, or molecular biology. You know, if you don't know much about it, you're going to have trouble reading an article about it. I think what's less obvious is how much we draw on our background knowledge as educated adults all the time, you know, reading newspaper articles, magazine articles, listening to news reports even. It's not just reading comprehension. And so now to illustrate that, I'm going to show you a paragraph from another newspaper article, not about cricket, chosen pretty much at random. And it's actually an op-ed from the New York Times, a paragraph from there. As you read through this, or you listen to me read through this, I'd like you to just think about what knowledge you're drawing on to make sense of the paragraph. 2 appeals by the president in his private capacity and represented by private lawyers have reached the Supreme Court in the past week. 1, Trump v. Vance, is a formal appeal from a ruling by the Federal Appeals Court in New York upholding the validity of a grand jury subpoena obtained by the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, and served on the president's accountants for his personal and business tax records. So aside from some complex syntax here, what I'm seeing is a lot of vocabulary that assumes some knowledge of the American legal system. What an appeal is, what an appeals court is, what a grand jury is, what a subpoena is, what a district attorney is. And if you know those terms, you don't need to have deep knowledge of them. You don't need to know all the things that go into issuing a subpoena. But as long as you have some familiarity with these terms, you can probably make sense of this paragraph. But if you don't know a lot of those terms, or many of those terms, then it's going to be pretty difficult to make sense of this. And this is something that is true of all written text. Authors do not explain every term they use, because if they did, it would be very tedious reading. So they assume certain background knowledge on the part of the reader. And if you have that background knowledge, you're fine. If you don't, you're in trouble. So why is that? Why does this prior knowledge help with comprehension? It has to do with working memory, which is kind of like short-term memory, kind of like consciousness. The important things to know about working memory are that it can only hold a limited number of things for a limited period of time. And the more things you're juggling in working memory, the less space you have there for things like comprehension or analysis or all sorts of things. This really underlies not just reading comprehension, but all learning, or really all thinking. So the more you can store in your long-term memory, the more information you have stored there, the less you have to juggle in working memory. So if you know the meaning of a term like subpoena, you don't have to think about what does that mean. You don't have to break off to look it up. You can just withdraw it from your long-term memory, which really has a pretty much infinite capacity. So that's why prior knowledge is so important to comprehension and other things. Well, what does this have to do with testing and test scores? Well, passages on reading tests, like all writing, make certain assumptions about what the reader is going to know. And they are not, those passages, of course, tied to anything that kids might have learned in school. They're really designed not to be tied to anything kids might have learned in school, because the idea is we're not testing knowledge, we're testing reading skills, reading comprehension skills. But, if you don't have the knowledge to make sense of the reading passage, or to get the meaning of the reading passage, you're not going to have a chance to demonstrate your skills. And test designers understand the importance of background knowledge, so they'll try to balance the passages on reading tests. So if there's a passage about blizzards and they think, well, kids in the north are going to have more knowledge of blizzards, they might put in a passage about hurricanes. But if you are really lacking knowledge of the world in general, then you're always going to be at a disadvantage. So to get a sense of what this actually looks like in the testing context, I'm going to show you a paragraph from a 3rd grade standardized reading comprehension test. And here goes. In one of the most remote places in the world, the Canadian Arctic, a people have survived over 1,000 years. They are the Inuit. For the Inuit, the Arctic is a place teeming with life. Depending on how far north they live, the Inuit find everything from caribou herds and polar bears to beluga whales. Now, to us as educated adults, that looks pretty straightforward. But I'm going to show you the same paragraph with the words and phrases missing that a lot of 3rd graders are unlikely to know. And when you're missing that much information, this becomes as impenetrable as that paragraph about cricket was if you don't know much about cricket. Now, some 3rd graders, of course, will know those words and phrases. they tend to be the third graders. If they've picked that knowledge up outside school, they tend to be the third graders with more educated, more highly educated families. The other third graders depend on school for this kind of knowledge and vocabulary. And unfortunately, they are the least likely to get it there in our current system. And the reason is, so the elementary school day has always been dominated by reading and math, but especially in the last 20 years, as reading and math tests have become so important, what has happened is these other subjects have been marginalized or eliminated from the curriculum, especially in schools where test scores are low. So social studies, the arts, usually the first to go, and to a lesser extent, science. And the purpose behind that is to boost reading and math scores and devote more time to reading and math, and especially a lot of the time devoted to these reading comprehension skills. The irony or the tragedy here is that those subjects that have been eliminated in many schools are the ones that are the most likely to build the kind of knowledge that kids are going to need to do well on reading comprehension tests and in life, really. So we've really been undermining our own efforts to boost these reading outcomes. You may be wondering, though, what does this have to do with high school? Why are these problems so apparent in high school, but not so apparent in elementary school? Well, there are a couple of reasons, a couple of things going on here. One is that knowledge of the topic does not just help you understand what you're reading. It also helps you absorb and retain new information. So it has been said, I did not coin this metaphor, but I like it, that knowledge is like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. And so kids who start out with more knowledge and vocabulary are able to read more sophisticated texts and retain more information and vocabulary from them because they are more likely to have that other half of the Velcro. The other kids who start out with less knowledge and vocabulary, especially in our leveled reading system, are limited to simpler texts with simpler vocabulary, and they're less able to retain new information and vocabulary even from those simpler texts because they're less likely to have the Velcro needed to do that. So this goes on year after year, and by the time kids get to high school, those kids who have been acquiring more and more knowledge and vocabulary, which enables them to read yet more complex text and acquire yet more complex vocabulary, they've been zooming ahead while the others have been falling farther and farther behind every year. And you get what has been called the Matthew effect in reading, which is a reference to the Gospel of St. Matthew, and particularly to the part that can be rendered as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so what starts out as not a huge gap, by the time kids get to high school, there is quite a large gap between the good readers and the poor readers, and it's much harder to narrow at that point. And in these earlier years, it can look like that skills and strategies approach to comprehension is working, but that's largely because the books that kids are reading, the test passages they're likely to get, don't assume that much background knowledge. When they get to upper grade levels, more and more knowledge is assumed, and so that's why test scores often fall off at upper grade levels, and the gap gets wider. And of course, there's another gap that we see in high school, which is the difference between what we assume high school students know and what many do know. This narrow curriculum, this approach to reading comprehension, can go on, especially in schools where test scores are low, can go on through middle school. And so kids can arrive, and do arrive often, at high school without ever having had any systematic exposure to history or geography or science or really anything but reading and math. And I've talked to a lot of teachers in high poverty high schools. This is not limited to high poverty high schools, but I think you see it most starkly there. These teachers have told me they've had kids at all levels of ability, but they have also told me it's not uncommon to have kids entering and even leaving high school who lack some very basic knowledge of the world. Things like the difference between a city and a state, or a country and a continent, or the ability to find the United States on a map of the world, or their hometown on a map of the United States. or sense of historical chronology, or really what history is all about. And it's not because they can't learn these things. It's because no one has taught them these things. And yet they get to high school and they're expected to read and understand a textbook like this. And if you don't know what Europe is, you don't know so many things, or really even what a country is as opposed to a continent, this is going to be a very frustrating experience to try to read a textbook like this. And it'll be frustrating for teachers as well. So when I stumbled across this problem, as I said, it was, explained to me eventually, I was really shocked because I thought I knew a lot about education. I've been writing about it. I've been, I was on the board of a charter school, and I've been reading everything I could get my hands on it. I had never heard this problem mentioned, that there was a lack of content in the elementary curriculum that had these tremendous repercussions later on. In fact, I'd been in a lot of elementary school classrooms, but I just thought they were trying to teach substantive material and build knowledge. I realized I hadn't understood what I was looking at, and it seemed to me that maybe a lot of other people didn't understand that either. Now, there were some people who were aware of this issue and had been concerned about it for a long time, but I realized, and they were very helpful to me, but I realized that they were basically just talking to each other. It had been written about, but it had been written about in a kind of dry academic way. And it seemed to me that what was needed was a book that would be written in a more journalistic, maybe engaging way, that would help get this issue into the public conversation about education. And so that's the book I tried to write, The Knowledge Gap. And I felt a tremendous sense of urgency then when I was researching and writing this book. But in the last several months, that sense of urgency has just skyrocketed, because with remote learning, this problem is getting worse by the day. We know that the roots of the knowledge gap lie in the experiences that kids have outside school, at home. And of course, now they're home 24/7, even if they're getting some remote instruction. And we know also that the more vulnerable kids are having more difficulty accessing that. The kids who have more highly educated parents are effortlessly picking up a lot of knowledge and vocabulary that other kids are unable to get. So what can we do about this? Where can we go from here? And the good news is there's a lot that schools and teachers can do about this problem. Even now, even during a time of remote or hybrid learning, there's a lot that can be done. So here are some ideas about ways to build both skills and knowledge during remote learning. One is, this is pretty simple. Have kids watch videos with the captions turned on to build fluency, fluency is considered to be a skill. It's also been called the bridge between foundational skills, between decoding and comprehension. And there is evidence that having kids do something like watch videos with the captions on, assuming that they have the basics of decoding under their belts, can really help them become fluent readers. So that's something teachers can do, that's something parents can do. Second, ask questions about content, not primarily on comprehension skills and strategies, which we know are kind of not really skills, pretty much illusory. And if the teacher is working from a basal reader, the questions are likely to put those skills and strategies in the foreground. Okay, now we're going to learn how to make an inference, or we're going to determine author's purpose. But you don't have to use those questions. You can make up new questions that are really about the content. Now, thirdly, that should say three. It's important to stay on the same topic for a while. It could be sea mammals, the human digestive system. With the standard approach to comprehension, the topic, it doesn't really matter what the topic is. It could be zebras one day, clouds the next. But it's important to stay on a topic for maybe a couple of weeks to give kids repeated exposure to the same language, vocabulary, the same concepts, so that they have a chance to really absorb that information and store it in their long-term memories. So that may involve supplementing a basal reader, which is unlikely to have that much information about any particular topic. So that would mean creating maybe sets of texts on the same topic. And this is something that, you know, schools can do collaboratively. We don't have to have each teacher doing this individually because it could be a lot of work. Ideally, these texts will be at different levels of difficulty. So the most difficult ones that kids could not read on their own, those would be read by the teacher or a parent or caregiver, and then maybe there'll be one on the same topic that they could read on their own. And as we know from the baseball study, if you already have some knowledge of the topic, you're probably going to be able to read more and understand a text on that topic more easily. And then having students write about what they're learning. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that can be a terrific way to foster engagement and build knowledge and reinforce knowledge. So following on that, focusing on content, and this is particularly helpful in a remote learning situation where it can be difficult sometimes to engage and motivate students. And parents may have a difficult time sometimes with a skills-focused approach to comprehension. For example, this is something I saw on Twitter a few months ago, near the beginning of the pandemic. This gentleman says, "This is the remote reading lesson I taught to my kindergartner yesterday. I am a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, and I could not correctly identify the main idea in this passage, though the instructions assured us it was in there. Can you find it?" Now, this is nothing against the teacher who sent this home. I mean, teachers have been trained to focus on these skills, but parents, you know, are like, "What are you talking about? Main idea?" You know, there isn't one in this paragraph, or "What do you mean about author's purpose?" or whatever. And it's really, I have talked to quite a few parents now who have been struggling with remote learning, and they have told me that it's very hard to get their kids to do these worksheets these reading comprehension worksheets that are coming home and that focus on skills. They've also told me, a number of these parents, that they supplemented or substituted for these worksheets with things that really did focus on content, things they found online, books that, you know, they could read with their kids and just focus on the content. And the kids, even though they didn't have to do those lessons, they really wanted to. They were far more engaged, far more motivated. And the parents not only were able to help kids, you know, find out more about rocks or whatever online, they were learning stuff themselves and they actually enjoyed it. So this focus on content can be a real help during remote learning and otherwise. But just to take a minute on some more general tips about how to make remote learning work better, because remote learning is going to be with us for a while. And even if it goes away with this pandemic, it may come back. This is a piece I did for Forbes a few months ago, really drawing on cognitive science on learning in general and how that applies to the remote learning situation. And most of these things will apply to in classroom face-to-face instruction as well. It's just that you need even more of it to make remote learning work well. The first thing, of course, is just to get students into the habit of participating. And I know a lot of teachers have had trouble just getting kids to show up. There may not be anything you can do about that with some students, but if you can play on things like their fear of missing out, that can help make the expectations very clear. Something like 40% of our behavior supposedly is habit. So if you can just set clear goals and clear times for when things are supposed to happen and try to foster a habit, that can help. Secondly, keep it simple. You know, don't use too many different platforms, stick to a routine so kids know what to expect. And generally, remote learning, distance learning works better for review. So initially the advice was to concentrate just on reviewing old material that had already been covered. But after a while, of course, you are going to need to introduce some new things. When you do that, it's important to connect new content to what students already know. That is as with reading comprehension, what you already know is going to have a lot to do with how successful you are at learning something new. So the more you can connect new content to old, the better. And when you do introduce a new concept or skill, it's important to first provide some examples, worked examples, so that students can see, what is this math problem? What does this concept in math look like when it's worked through? Fourth, don't go on too long like I'm doing now. It's best to dole out new information in brief doses. It's been found that student engagement can drop after just about 9 to 12 minutes when they're watching videos. Fifth, it's important to keep things interactive, to keep kids engaged, and that can take the form of quizzes, pauses in videos. Just, if they can't turn and talk, you could say, here's something I want you to think about, or maybe write down your thoughts on this, pause the video and do this. It's also really, if you can, it's important to give quick feedback, and in some situations that won't be possible. But it's hard enough to know whether kids are understanding things in a face-to-face situation. It's even harder when it's remote. So quizzes and questions can be a very important comprehension check. And then if you can correct any misimpressions quickly, the quicker the better. And along those lines, there's synchronous and asynchronous learning. These are terms that we probably are all familiar with now if we weren't 6 months ago. But synchronous is, everybody doing it at the same time. Asynchronous is everybody doing the same thing, but at different times. And some tasks are going to be better suited to synchronous and some to asynchronous. But to build those habits of participation, to foster a sense of engagement and community, it is important to have some kind of synchronous class interaction if you can. And then lastly, as I said before, really important to focus on content rather than on those comprehension skills and strategies. So what about when kids do return to the classroom, and we know eventually they will? Well, we should continue doing all those things that I was just talking about to build knowledge. In addition, it's important to be skeptical about reading levels. As we know from the baseball study and others, that they are not always going to be a reliable guide to what kids are going to be able to read. And along those lines, unlike this classroom library in the picture, might try organizing classroom libraries by topic rather than reading level, or have some books at least organized by topic. I don't know if you can see this, but in this picture, there are some topic baskets on the bottom shelf, but they're very general, like animals. Just because you've learned about whales doesn't mean you're going to have the background knowledge to understand a book about ponies. So maybe be more specific than animals, especially if it's a topic that kids have actually learned about through listening and discussion. And then, learning loss has been mentioned, and there is a lot of concern about measuring and addressing learning loss. But just, think about, what does that really mean in a situation like the elementary ELA reading comprehension curriculum, where the same skills are repeated year after year? So what if students really missed, if they're, again, going to be getting find the main idea, comparing and contrasting grade after grade, and what's supposed to be changing is the level at which students are reading. But of course, many of them are not reading at grade level anyway. So the debate about whether to do grade level work or go back to the previous grade level also doesn't really relate to this context, because in many classrooms, many kids are doing the bulk of their reading not on grade level, but at their supposed individual level. So I would argue that probably the worst thing that we can do when kids come back to the classroom is to just test their reading levels and say, okay, you've slipped from a level K to a level I, go to the basket of level I books and practice your skills and strategies. That's only going to be compounding the learning loss that has taken place. And really the learning loss that takes place even before the pandemic, that takes place while kids are in school. The gap remember, gets wider every year, the gap between the kids at the good readers and the poor readers. And that's because of the way we've been teaching. So doing more of that will not work to address learning loss. Now, longer term, what really is most effective to build knowledge is for a school or a district to adopt a content-focused literacy curriculum. And there have been several that have been developed in the last 6-7 years, really. They're all fairly new. These are just some that I know of. There are some others out there now. And they're all different. They cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways. But it's important to have a curriculum like this because knowledge building is a gradual, cumulative process. And there's a lot that an individual teacher can do to build knowledge, but an individual teacher doesn't have control over what students learned the year before or the year after. And you know, that's not going to be as effective as a curriculum that builds knowledge in a fairly coherent, logical sequence. And all of these do that to a greater or lesser extent. So as I said, they're all different, but they all have a couple of things in common. And one is that they're organized by topic rather than by skill, which is very important. Secondly, they all have teachers reading aloud to kids, especially at early elementary levels, from books that those kids could not read themselves, reading aloud to the class as a whole, so that all students have access to the same content. And that reading aloud from complex texts is important for two reasons. One is that it's not just background knowledge that really helps you understand what you're reading. It's also familiarity with the conventions of written language. Written language is almost always more complex than spoken language. It has its own syntax, its own vocabulary. And if students are eventually going to be able to understand those conventions on their own and their independent reading, they have to get used to them by listening to them, by hearing them. Secondly, kids can take in more sophisticated information through listening than through their own reading, on average through middle school. So I wouldn't stop reading complex text to them once they've learned to decode, or even once they've learned to be pretty fluent decoders. I would continue doing that in many cases. Once they have taken in sophisticated concepts and vocabulary through listening and through discussion, they'll be in a better position to understand those concepts and that vocabulary in their own reading. So I wanted in this book also, as I mentioned, to make all of this, which is fairly abstract and complicated, to make it more concrete and engaging. And one of the things I tried to do was to follow a couple of classrooms through a school year. One using the standard comprehension skills focused approach, and the other using one of these newer curricula that focus on building kids' knowledge. And these two classrooms were not identical. No two classrooms are. One was first grade, one was second grade, but they were pretty similar. They were all kids from low-income families. They were all children of color. And the teachers in both of these classrooms were hardworking, smart, dedicated teachers. But the atmosphere in these classrooms was like night and day. And the main reason for that was what was being taught, the curriculum. And I wish I could show you videos of these two classrooms. I don't have videos, but I do have some pictures of posters. So this is from the skills-focused classroom, and all of the posters in the skills-focused classroom were on skills, like main idea, sequence of events. And it was really hard for the teacher to get a discussion going in this classroom because these were first graders. They really didn't have much to say about main idea or sequence of events or the difference between a caption and a subtitle or whatever. I mean, they actually wanted to talk about content more, but the teacher felt that was her training and her materials had led her to believe that was not important. So she kind of deflected those questions rather than answering them. In the content-focused classroom, the walls were covered with posters like this one, all about content. This one happens to be from the unit on Greek myths, which the kids loved. And this is the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And as you can see, it's all about content. These posters would be created collaboratively by the teachers and the students. during and after the daily read aloud. And there was a lot of really rich class discussion with these were second graders offering all sorts of interesting insights. But I'd like to point out a couple of things about this Daedalus and Icarus poster. One is the vocabulary: desperately, plummeted, foresight. These would be sophisticated vocabulary words for any second graders, but most of the second graders in this classroom were from non-English speaking families, and some were still learning English themselves, but they were using words like these in their conversation because they encountered them in these engaging stories, they heard them repeatedly, they used them in classroom discussion, and these words will stand them in good stead in years to come. I'd also like to point out what may look like skills on this poster. Predict, what is Daedalus's plan? Cause and effect, these boxes. But the teacher's not trying to teach the skill of making predictions or the skill of determining cause and effect. She's bringing those things in as a way to get kids to think about the content and to analyze it. And that's what works. It's not that you can never ask, what's the main idea? It's what you put in the foreground. If you put the content in the foreground, these quote unquote skills will develop pretty naturally. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that if you don't start building knowledge in kindergarten, all is lost. It's not too late to build knowledge in high school or to fill in gaps in background knowledge, but it is harder. And the approach that I have seen work best is to teach students to write about what they're learning. Writing is potentially a tremendously powerful lever for building knowledge and filling in gaps in knowledge. And why is that? Well, there's some research on writing and how it relates to knowledge. We know that writing about text strengthens reading comprehension of that text. We know that writing about content in subject areas, social studies, science, math, boosts learning. But there hasn't been a whole lot of research on writing per se. There has, however, been quite a bit of research on other things that enter into the writing process. One of those is something called retrieval practice, or the testing effect. And that boils down to recalling information that you've slightly forgotten. If you do that, then it boosts your retention of that information. It helps that information get cemented in your long-term memory. The other effect is what's known as the protege effect, and that boils down to explaining something or even planning to explain something to another person in your own words. That boosts both comprehension and retention. And both of these things, we do these when we write. Unless we're just copying something, we have to recall information we've slightly forgotten. We have to put it in our own words and explain it to somebody else, to a reader. But there's a big caveat here about how writing can build knowledge, and that is that writing is the hardest thing we ask students to do in school. And again, this has to do with working memory. So we know working memory can hold only a few things for a limited period of time. And if you're an inexperienced writer, you may be juggling, if you're young, letter formation, how to form the letters, spelling, word choice, organization, plus the content you're writing about. And that can be so overwhelming that you neither learn to write well, nor can you derive those knowledge building benefits from the writing process, because there's just too much going on in your working memory. So what can we do about this? Well, if we want to use writing as a way to build knowledge, two things. One is we have to ground writing activities and writing instruction in the content of the curriculum. So not an essay about your trip to the amusement park or whether we should have chocolate milk in the cafeteria, but if you're learning about the Civil War, you need to write about the Civil War. Secondly, to lessen this cognitive load, this load on working memory, we need to make writing easier. And the best way to do that is to begin writing instruction at the sentence level, because writing at length makes it an even more burdensome task for working memory. And that's true no matter what grade level students are in. There are a lot of high school students who still really have not mastered the art of constructing a good sentence. And I know of only one method that combines both of these things. Content. And that is this, there's a book called The Writing Revolution, which I co-authored with Judith Hochman, who is a veteran educator who came up with this method over many years of experimentation. And there's also an organization called the Writing Revolution that offers courses and works with schools in implementing this method. And it does both ground all writing activities and content, and it does begin at the sentence level. It does not end there, but it begins there. And it is designed to be used at any grade level and with any subject matter. In fact, it should be used across the curriculum for it to work really well. And I don't have time to go into all of the method, but I thought I would briefly show you one of the sentence level activities that is particularly powerful that we call because, but, and so. And this consists of giving sentence stems to students and having them complete those sentence stems using these 3 different conjunctions. This both teaches students how to use conjunctions, and it also gets them to think about the material they're learning in 3 different ways. So let's say you're a social studies teacher or a history teacher, you're teaching about the presidency of Andrew Jackson. You could give students the following sentence stem. Andrew Jackson was a popular president because, but, and so. Each of those requires students to think about some information they have slightly forgotten, put it in their own words, and explain it to the reader. And there are different ways that students could do this, but here are some examples. Because he was the champion of the common man, but there were many critics of his kitchen cabinet and spoils system, so he easily won re-election in 1832. And these exercises, these activities really do teach a lot of those skills and strategies that we try to teach through reading comprehension instruction. Cause and effect, but is a comparing and contrasting thing. And it's much more powerful when students are doing this in their own writing. But of course, in order to use writing as a way of building knowledge, there has to be some content in the curriculum in the first place. And that's the problem with a lot of elementary school curricula. This is really where that kind of writing instruction should start. But if there's often not enough content about any one topic in the curriculum to enable kids to really write about it coherently. So content-rich curriculum is the place to start, but it's not enough because most teachers, this approach to curriculum, this kind of curriculum is going to be very different from what they're used to and what they've been trained to do. And so it's probably going to require some professional development, some coaching, and there will probably be some obstacles to getting this kind of curriculum implemented well in the classroom, as there are with lots of new things that are based in the findings of science, as these curricula are. So just briefly, some of the obstacles that people, teachers, educators may encounter getting these scientific findings into classroom practice. There are 3, I would say, 3 basic categories. One is intellectual. And the basic thing here is that this information, the baseball study, the importance of building knowledge, is not something that teachers are likely to have heard about in their pre-service training or even in their in-service training. So it's going to be unfamiliar, and they may actually have been given information that contradicts the findings of cognitive science, that it's really not important to build kids' knowledge, that they're not going to be interested in learning facts, that they can always look things up. So that could be an obstacle. Second category of obstacles is emotional, the heart. And really that has a lot to do with feelings of guilt that, teachers have told me that, when they have switched to this new way of teaching, they have experienced feelings of guilt, because if you've been doing something for years in the sincere belief that you're helping kids, and somebody comes along and says, actually, not only were you not helping them, you may have been holding them back, that's a very difficult message to hear. And so people naturally can raise defenses against hearing that message. And then lastly, even if you've accepted the need to teach in a different way at an intellectual and an emotional level, there are behavioral obstacles, habit. Teaching is a very complex activity. Working memory enters into this again. And teachers may be juggling so many things in the moment that it can be hard to remember to do things differently. It's very easy to fall back into longstanding habits. So these are some possible obstacles. None of them are insurmountable, but it can take time and patience, and as I mentioned, professional development to overcome them. But not professional development as we have known it, not a one-day workshop on how to foster critical thinking. It's been found that really to be effective, professional development needs to be rooted in the specific content of the curriculum. So not how to foster critical thinking in general, but you're teaching about the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. How do you get your students to think critically about that? And secondly, rather than a one-day or half-day workshop, to really work, professional development needs to be cyclical and collaborative and ongoing. So it could look like teachers coming together, talking about something new they're going to try, going back to their classrooms and trying it, coming back and talking about how it went, and then talking about another new thing that they're going to try, and the cycle repeats. So though that's what can work. I've seen this work in schools that I've visited. Speaking of what does work, I'd just like to end with an anecdote that I heard when I was researching the book that I think illustrates the limitations of reading levels and also the possibilities of curriculum to really change and shape teachers' expectations. We hear a lot about the importance of high expectations, and they are important, but I've met a lot of teachers who did have high expectations. What they didn't have were the materials that would enable their students to meet those high expectations. So the story I heard, this was out in Reno, Nevada. There was a second grade teacher whose school had recently adopted one of these new content-focused curricula. It happened to be CKLA, Core Knowledge Language Arts. And she was giving a test to one of her students to determine his individual reading level. And this was a struggling second grader. In the test kit, the teacher saw that there was a text on the topic of westward expansion. And that happened to be the topic that the class had just spent 2 weeks learning about. But it was a text at a fourth grade level, and this was a struggling second grade reader. But just out of curiosity, the teacher handed the boy the text, and he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension. And that teacher's view of that child and what he was capable of probably changed as a result of that experience. And that child's view of himself and what he was capable of probably also changed. And one reason I feel so much urgency about this topic is that there are untold numbers of children out there who have been told, just practice your comprehension skills and strategies and you will become a better reader. And if that doesn't work, and there's really no evidence that it will work, those children may feel they have no one to blame but themselves, and they're just, in the dumb group, or they're just not bad readers. And there's really no reason for that. So we need to unlock the potential of those children and their teachers as soon as possible.